So the meeting this morning is how can the left gain from Trump's crisis, and our speaker is Nielsen, who's from the Socialist Workers' Party student office.
Okay, well look, I guess if the rumours in the press are true, the big orange bigot is going to be coming to London possibly in the next week, so we'll all have a good opportunity to protest and say what we think of him, and actually build on a fantastic protest we saw earlier this year over the Muslim ban. I think the place to start with this meeting really is by assessing the political situation in the US. It's obviously one of huge dangers. A president who's against abortion, who wants to ban Muslims, who wants to deport immigrants. There's obviously huge dangers in the US. But I think we also have to argue that there are possibilities. There is actually potential for resistance to emerge, for the left to grow, and so on. And I guess in that context, the question for us is, how can the left gain? In the context of a crisis for the president and with the political landscape polarising, how can the left gain out of that? And I guess one place to start really is by asking, why is it that Trump finds himself in crisis? Why is it that the administration is in turmoil? Because you don't really have to be an expert of US politics to see that it is an administration in turmoil. Any look at any headlines or any news stories, you see rumours of impeachment, of scandals, of FBI investigations, of blocked bills going through Congress, and so on. And so it's clearly an administration that has had a tumultuous 6 months. Now, the question for us is, what lies behind that? Because one thing I think is important to point out is that when Trump was on the campaign trail, he said that in the first 100 days it was going to be like no other, that he was going to deliver on all of his promises within the first 100 days, 6 months of his presidency. Actually, we have to point out that he hasn't really been able to do that. The healthcare bill, he managed to get it through, but he faced huge obstacles about that. The Muslim ban has been very stop-start. There was a recent lifting partially of the ban, but really the courts and more importantly people on the streets have blocked that ban going through. The wall in Mexico has yet to be built. So you see that this is clearly a president who hasn't had everything his own way by any means or by any stretch of the imagination. And I guess the reason for that is that within the administration there are fundamental divisions. There's fundamental divisions that stop Trump ruling coherently and mean that the White House is divided. Now, the mainstream media, to be honest, quite obsessed with the personality clashes, between Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump and Gary Cohn and all of this kind of thing. Actually, we have to say that what's happening in the White House and the divisions in the White House are much more profound than personality clashes. It's fair to say that Trump's administration really rests on an uneasy marriage of two sort of rival camps. There's two camps who are constantly battling it out for influence over the administration. The first camp is the group that's sort of centred around Gary Cohn. Gary Cohn is Trump's chief economic advisor. He's a former Goldman Sachs banker. In other words, he's a very much establishment figure of the US. And really the camp around him are really the architects of US liberal capitalism. The bankers, the bosses, the state officials, the security officials, who, to be honest, were absolutely horrified at Trump's presidential campaign. When Trump made the speeches on the campaign trail that he was going to pull the US out of NATO, that he was going to pull out of the trade deals, that he was going to bring in economic nationalism and so on, this first camp were very much shaking in their boots. And so what you've seen is that ever since Trump has been elected, they've tried to reel him in. They've tried to make him follow a similar line to US presidents, to maintaining the sort of liberal capitalist order. So that's the first camp. The second camp in Trump's administration is really the people who are centred around Steve Bannon. Now, I'm sure people know who Steve Bannon is. He's a misogynist who has a record of violence against women. He was editor of Breitbart, which is a nasty right-wing website that has links to the far right, or the alt-right as they like to call themselves. And really Steve Bannon's goal in life is to tear up the order that that the first camp represent. Steve Bannon wants to pull out of the trade deals. He wants to tear up NATO, he wants to bring forward economic nationalism, he wants a more right-wing social agenda. He's sort of aligned with the evangelical right who are against abortion and so on. And so you see that what lies behind the chaos in Trump's campaign, Trump's administration, is that there's two rival camps who are constantly battling it out for influence over the president. And it's really an ongoing seesaw between the two. I mean, the healthcare bill debacle that happened about a month ago kind of showed up and it illustrated what the divisions were really, because in that debate you had, on the one hand, the more sort of moderate Republicans around Gary Cohn in the first camp, who, to be honest, were worried that stripping away Obamacare would alienate Republican voters and it would leave poorer people without health care, and thought that the bill went too far. Then you had the other camp who said that the bill didn't go far enough, that it left too much intact, and that they should have stripped away more of the very limited healthcare support that exists at the moment. So it's an ongoing battle between the two sides of the administration. I think for us though in this meeting, the focus isn't the battle that's within the White House, it's the battle against it. The battle on the streets, the campaigns against Trump, the resistance, and so on. And I think we have to say that since his inauguration, we have seen a massive potential for resistance against Trump. The scale of the protests and the scale of the resistance, the scale of the organising against the president and his reactionary agenda, I think has been inspiring. And when you read any sort of left-wing blog that comes out of the US or an activist blog from the US, what they all say is that they think at this moment in time there's huge numbers, or the biggest numbers seen in generation, biggest numbers of people who are radicalising, who are getting political, and so on. And of course this all kicked off with the Women's March that happened the day after Trump got elected. 1 million people marched in Washington, and they estimate that it was the biggest day of global protest since the Iraq War in 2003. A very impressive day. But you see, the significance about the Women's March, I think, was not just the scale of the protest, but also it was a reminder about how protests can shift the national debate. If you read any interview with activists at the moment going on in the US, what a huge number of them say is, my first protest was the Women's March, or the Women's March gave me inspiration, the Women's March was a watershed. And it's not even just amongst those activist circles, even the mainstream media and this sort of liberal commentariat, even they have to say really that the Women's March was a watershed because it showed that from the very first day, Trump's reactionary agenda was going to have a resistance on the streets and so on. This obviously then continued into the Muslim ban protests. I mean, people will remember the scenes of hundreds of thousands of people, of blocking the airports, sitting down on the runways in the freezing cold and so on. This was very impressive, not just because of what they did, but also to take on the Islamophobia that has been at the heart of the war on terror, that was at the heart of the Bush administration, that is pumped out daily by Fox News and so on, gives us great hope for taking on some of the ideological pinnacles of Trump's agenda, really. And so, both the Muslim ban protests and the Women's March, I think, gave us fantastic inspiration. And since then, we've seen a plethora of other things emerge. The Fight for 15 campaign continues, the Sanctuary Campus movement, the resistance to deporting immigrants, and so on. But you see, what I'd argue is that the most significant development for the left in the United States recently has been something that happened before the inauguration of Trump, and that was the movement behind Sanders. I don't think we can underestimate the significance of the fact that someone who called themselves a socialist, who started off as an absolute fantasy candidate when he kicked off his campaign, for him to run Clinton really close, for him to get 13 million votes, calling for democratic socialism, calling for left-wing politics, railing against Wall Street and so on, I don't think we can undermine the significance of that. Remember in the US, 20 years ago, being a liberal was a dirty word, let alone calling yourself a socialist. And I think the Sanders campaign has changed the mood in America, because the first thing it did, the first thing we can get from it really, is it counters a narrative that 2016 shows that the US is just right-wing and racist, and working-class people in the US all agree with Trump. The Sanders campaign showed that when you give a left pole of attraction, you can win people to ideas that aren't based on racism and reaction, but are actually based on more progressive ideas. I think it also showed as well that it is incredibly important that it provided an alternative to Clinton. It said that the way to fight Trump, and the way to fight his racism, and the way to fight his reactionary agenda was not by occupying the centre ground, not by occupying the cosmopolitan, libertarian nature of Clinton and so on. It said that actually if you wanted to have a fight for the future of America, it would be by going towards a left pole of attraction. And to see the fact that millions of people voted for Sanders, millions went to his rallies, millions organised on the doorstep, put forward socialist arguments for the first time and so on. If you combine that with the movement we've seen since the election, I think you get a sense of a big potential in America for a new left to emerge and for resistance to Trump. But I guess the key question for us really is, where does it go from here? Because we're now 6 months in. His agenda is as reactionary as ever. He finds himself in crisis. His administration isn't coherent. Where does the movement go? Where does the movement on the streets? Where does the support for Sanders? Where does it go now? Who can give that movement a lead? One thing we can be certain of is that the Democrat elite, the senior Democrats, are incapable of giving that movement a lead. Since Trump got elected, the senior Democrats have shown themselves completely incapable of leading any kind of resistance to him. I think the main reason for this really is that they have shown absolutely no signs of learning from the election result. They clearly have not learned the lessons of why it was that Clinton lost in November. Clinton herself actually came out of her hibernation recently. She's been in hibernation since the election. She came out of it about a month ago and did an interview with CNN. And really what she said is, if it wasn't for the Russian hacking rumours and the FBI scandal, I'd be president. This is living in fantasy land. Study after study has shown that the reason the Democrats lost is because they couldn't mobilise their own base. In state after state, they couldn't mobilise working class people to vote for Clinton. You look at collapsed on 2012 for the Democrats. Same with the Latino vote, the same with the vote for women as well. And actually you see that the working class as a whole could not bring themselves to vote for Clinton as they had voted for Obama in previous years. And I think that there's one stat that I always point to that I think illustrates and encapsulates what the whole election was about, and that's what happened in Michigan. Because in Michigan, Trump won the state by 12,000 votes. So he got 12,000 votes more than Clinton. In Michigan, 90,000 Democrats, 90,000 of them, went to the polling booth on polling day. They voted on the voting sheet. They voted for local positions. They voted for the local sheriff, but they left the option of president blank. 90,000 people in Michigan could not bring themselves to vote for Clinton. These aren't people who have been pulled over by Trump. They're not people who are voting for the racism and the sexism and the tax cuts for the rich. These are people who are Democrats but could not bring themselves to vote for someone who was pro-business, pro-Wall Street, and wanted to continue the status quo and so on. And the fact that the Democrats don't accept this and haven't come to terms with it and haven't understood it really, and haven't understood that their own base, don't want change but don't want more of the same but want change, means that their strategy now hasn't changed really since the election. So what is their strategy to take on Trump? Really, they think about taking on Trump without taking on his politics. So what is their main line of attack? If you look at all of the senior Democrats and the establishment blogs and so on, what they consistently attack Trump over is the links with Russia. They say that Trump is unpatriotic, he's unfit for office, and so on. Rather than attacking his views on abortion, rather than attacking him on cutting taxes for the rich, rather than attacking him on the Muslim ban, on the way he's treating immigrants and so on, they say, oh, he's got links to Russia, you can't trust him, he's a Russian stooge, and so on. And this is really part of a wider strategy which says that the way to take on Trump is to not take on his reactionary agenda, not to argue with the politics, but to say that he's unfit for office, he's unpresidential. And it's almost as if they're attacking him on moral grounds rather than political ones. And this means there's big problems for them, because the first problem with this approach is that it completely misunderstands why Trump got elected in the first place. Part of Trump's big appeal was that he wasn't like a normal politician, that he wasn't presidential. You know, that's a reason why a lot of people voted for him. But secondly, this approach by the Democrat elite completely misunderstands why a movement has erupted since the inauguration of Trump. Why is it that during the Muslim ban protests, why did thousands of people get a train, travel an hour to their local airport and sit in the freezing cold to block the runways? Was it because they thought that the Muslim ban was unprecedented or unfit for office? No, it's because they wanted to take on the big questions of racism that was at the heart of the ban. Why have we seen a big movement since Trump was inaugurated support against immigration raids and against deportations with the sanctuary campuses and so on? Is it because the people involved think that deporting immigrants is unpresidential? Well, no, it's the opposite. Obama deported 3 million immigrants during his time in office. It's because these people recognise that Trump represents a reactionary agenda and they recognise the importance of mobilising against it. And this is something the Democrat elite have failed to come to terms with. It's obviously partly down to their ideology, that a lot of them are liberal Democrats or right-wing Democrats who, to be honest, have supported deportations and so on. But it's also because the focus of the Democrats is the midterm elections in 2018 and the presidential elections in 2020. And you see, they're not really focused on defending abortion rights or preventing deportations or saving healthcare. They are focused on getting re-elected in the midterms and in 2020. And that means that if your focus is on the elections, it means two things. It means, firstly, you accept the argument that to win over Trump voters, you have to be more right-wing. So this is what we've actually seen since the election, is that Democrat candidates in local elections are more right-wing, they've chosen anti-abortion candidates and so on. But it also means that actually it doesn't really suit the Democrat elite to get rid of Trump. And so what you've seen recently is blogs talking about the impeachment trap, blogs of high-level Democrats and interviews with them saying that actually, if they're against impeaching Trump, because what would be good for the Democrats is to leave Trump in place, to pick up more seats in 2018 and then to win the presidential election in 2020. And this actually came to a head when one of the key Democrat strategists, a woman called Caitlin Legacki, said this to the New York Times. She said, "Our best shot at stopping Trump and stopping the Republicans has always been to let them cannibalise themselves." In other words, the strategy of the Democrat elite is to sit back, provide little opposition and wait for Trump and the Republicans to implode. So that's what those at the top of the Democrats are doing. To be honest, you wouldn't expect much better than them, but it's important to see what they're saying. The key question for us, though, is what is Sanders doing about it? Sanders and his millions of supporters, what is their approach to the fact that the Democrat elite have been so incapable of providing any opposition? What are they doing to provide an opposition to Trump? Because like I said, there's no doubt that the Sanders campaign was the outstanding development in US politics over the last couple of years. The millions who were encouraged to vote for him, to organise, and so on. Actually, it's quite interesting. When you read any interview from the Women's March or the Muslim ban protests, probably 95% of people say, I was politicised by Bernie. I went to Bernie rallies, he's the first politician I fought for, he's the first time I got politically active, and so on. And so that means that what Sanders does has really big implications. It has massive implications, not just for the left in America, but for the millions of people who were inspired by him. And you see, one thing Sanders does say is that he does disagree with Clinton, that the reason she lost the election was the FBI or the Russia thing. He says that the Democrats lost the election because we couldn't mobilise our base. He says that people were fed up with the status quo and we were offering them more, so they didn't vote for us. So that, this is a positive thing. He starts from the correct point. The difficulty with Sanders, I think, though, is that he admits that his main goal really is to transform the Democrats. Bernie Sanders is completely wedded to the idea that the focus for the left in the US should be to pull the Democrats to the left, to run left-wing candidates, get left-wing people elected, and so on. And so it was quite interesting recently, about a month ago, there was something called the People's Summit that was held in the US. This was a big conference hosted by the NNU, the National Nurses Union. Sanders spoke at it, Socialist groups were there, trade unions were there and so on. It was a really sort of big debate about where next for the left. And in the main session that Sanders spoke in, speaker after speaker from the floor questioned the strategy of winning the Democrats for the left, to the left. Trade unions got up and said, look, I've got difficulties with saying that we now have to line up behind the Democrats, we have to get behind them for 2018 and 2020, and so on. And Sanders, when put under pressure, wouldn't budge on the idea that the absolute focus for left-wing activists was to win the Democrats over to the left. And I think this loyalty to the Democrats, I think, prevents Sanders from giving an adequate lead to the movement against Trump. I think it prevents him from giving a lead to the millions of people who wanted a political revolution, not a Democrat revolution, a political revolution. I think his loyalty to the Democrats prevents him from doing this, because once you're loyal to the Democrats, and once that's your main thing, your focus is to win elections, is to support Democrat candidates. And I think if this happens, and if this is the focus of the left in America, the potential on the ground will be squandered. Now, how do we know this? A good example is what happened in Omaha, in Nebraska, because I think about 6 weeks ago, there was a mayoral election in Omaha, and the Democrats, in line with their policy of trying to win over conservative voters, they chose a candidate called Heath Mello. Heath Mellow's a right-wing Democrat. He's actually very anti-abortion. He's got a consistent record of campaigning against abortion rights, restricting abortion access, and so on. Now, there was a lot of pressure on Sanders, but Sanders made the decision to speak at a rally endorsing Heath Mello. Sanders encouraged people to vote for someone who wanted to restrict abortion rights. And of course there was uproar, quite rightly, from the activists in Sanders' campaign. And Sanders had this to say. He said, if we are going to protect a women's right to choose, at the end of the day, we're going to need democratic control over the House, over the Senate, and in state governments all over this nation. And you see, I just think if you put that in context of a growing women's movement on the streets, the fantastic Women's March, a growing abortion rights campaigns, a growing campaign to support Planned Parenthood, for Sanders then to say that the utmost thing, whatever your views on abortion, are to back the Democrats, I think shows that his loyalty lies with the Democrat Party rather than with the movements on the streets. And I think that's a mistake. And I think time and time again we'll see that a loyalty to the Democrats can compromise the movement on the streets. Another example, I think, is what's happening around healthcare at the moment, because there is absolute uproar at what Trump's healthcare bill wants to do. It's going to leave 24 million Americans, possibly more, without access to healthcare. It's going to take away the limited gains of Obamacare. I think you could say that there's a huge potential to have a national march for health in the US. If Bernie Sanders put out a call and said that, just like the Women's March, I want 1 million people with me in Washington marching to defend healthcare, for more healthcare access, and so on, I think he'd get it. He'd get the unions alongside him, he'd get the left, and so on. But there's a gaping hole there, but Sanders has not really done anything to mobilise his base about the healthcare issue, despite the fact that there's been huge uproar. And so I think you can see that that for the left in America, the question of the Democrats is actually central. The question of how you relate to the mood around Sanders while not getting dragged into the Democrats and the Democrats acting like a sponge on that mood, I think is a central one for the left. Now, one interesting development in this has been recently we've seen the sort of limited rise of a group called the Democrat Socialists of America, the DSA. People might have heard of them. They've been around for a while. They were formed in 1982. And really what the DSA say is that they support left-wing candidates in the Democrats, and they also support running independent candidates where you can. They also do campaigns, they're involved in a protest and so on. But the reality is that since their inception, they have been focused on pulling the Democrats leftwards. They do have quite a decent base. Since the election, they've gone from 5,000 members to about 22,000 quite recently, and they have some quite high-profile supporters. So people might know Cornel West, a figure on the American left, a sort of anti-racist. He's the chair of the DSA. Jacobin magazine, which I'm sure some people have read. It has some very interesting articles about what's going on in the US. Most of the contributors to Jacobin argue for the left to be within inside the DSA and therefore within the Democrats. And I think we have to say it's a positive development for an organisation that is, calling for socialist mobilisation and so on. This is a positive development that their numbers have gone up, and the fact that they have the right starting point, I think, about how can you win the Bernie Sanders supporters to a more left-wing vision than what the Democrats offer. This is a positive thing, but I'd argue that the way to do that is not inside the Democrats, because I think once you start running candidates in the Democrats, what you're doing is you're encouraging people to join the Democrats to vote for those candidates. And I think once you're encouraging people to join the Democrats, you're really saying that there's no hope for an organisation to the left of the Democrats, and really you're building a party that wouldn't tolerate Bernie Sanders, let alone anyone to the left of him, hasn't provided any opposition to Trump, is focused on 2018, is not building the movement on the streets, and so on. And I think we have to ask, is this the best way to gain from Trump's crisis? Because there are huge possibilities, but like I said, I think there is a big danger that the Democrats will act like a sponge. And actually, that's not from any kind of, speaking from the outside. If you look at the history of the Democrats, movement after movement, from the civil rights all the way through to Obama, the Democrats have acted like a sponge on the anger from below. And actually, I think a better way of putting it would be saying that the mass resistance we've seen since the inauguration and the support for Sanders shows that there's a potential for a new force to the left of the Democrats. There is clearly a gap for a new party on the left, or a new organisation on the left of American politics, that says actually we're not going to be holden to corporate interests like the Democrat elite are, and that, to be honest, we're not going to settle for voting for the best left-wing candidate, or, to be honest, having to get behind right-wing candidates like Hillary Clinton and being given the sort of lesser evilism that the Democrats offer. And I think we have to point to the millions who were inspired by Sanders, the inspirational resistance we've seen on the streets since then, and that say that actually the energy and the scale of those struggles show a potential to build a new movement that can break the two-party system. Because I think one thing we can be clear of is that Trump's crisis isn't going to go away. Trump's success and delivering on his promises depends on having a strong US economy. Anyone who was in the Michael Roberts, the economist, his meeting yesterday, would have seen that Michael Roberts said that Trump's wild predictions of a 4% growth rate for the US, this is fake news. This is not going to happen. Even more pertinently, real GDP in the US, the amount of money people actually have in their pocket, shows no sign of rising whatsoever. And that puts Trump in difficulty, because that means his promises of more jobs, of more infrastructure, of better living standards for working class Americans, that means he can't deliver. And I think the key question for us is, can that working class anger that got Trump elected and that got behind Bernie Sanders, can that develop into something more concrete that can fuse with the resistance since we've seen since the inauguration? And I think we have to say it can, because what we've seen over the last year or two things have become clear. The first is that left-wing politics are back on the map in the US. The support for Sanders and so on shows this. But that also, there's a huge potential for protest and resistance on the streets. And I think for that reason, the political situation, of course, has huge dangers, but there's also one of enormous potential. And for that reason, I think we say that the left can gain and it can grow as well.
Thank you, and thanks for the analysis. My name is Linda. I'm from Canada, and I'm a dual citizen. I was born in the States, and so I have a big interest in following the politics. Canada is, like a little puppy dog tail, the giant United States. So what happens in the U.S. is very important to us. When Trump was elected, the day after, I started to have a sense that people were listening to me and my socialist politics in a very different way. I'm in Canada because I was married to a draft dodger in 1968. So been on the left wing of things for a long time. And I had a sense that there was something very familiar to the way that people were talking about Trump's election and their feelings about it and what they wanted to do about it and how open they were to talking about what it meant. And what it reminded me of was the early 60s. I had this sense that at both times, now and in the early 60s, the fear of even using a word like socialist, much less communist, was like just, you know, rampant through all parts of the U.S. Less so in Canada because there's a Democratic Socialist Party there, but pretty much liberal, just a left liberal party. But anyway, in the U.S., all of a sudden people were saying, wait, what is this socialism anyway? What does that mean? What are you talking about? And that's what I'm hearing now. I work at a school, a graduate school, and we decided that we had to do something. We had to take a stand, and so we made a declaration that's something like on the recent events have revealed a conflict between the idea that only some people are deserving of respect and the idea that everyone deserves to be respected and have dignity. And our school stands on the side of people insisting that everyone deserves to live free of oppression and deprivation, what we want for ourselves and we want for all. And this, I've gone to conferences and spread this around, and people are saying that. Now this is not, you know, we're not starting a party here, I'm afraid. It's just, you know, just middle-class graduate school. But the fact that people are open to discussing that, that's the difference. And that's why I think you're exactly right, that the time has been, the time now is very different from the past. The Democratic Party has always been the graveyard of left-wing movements, and we don't want to repeat that again. And so it's my fervent hope that my friends in the U.S. will do something different.
Comrade in the check shirt, were you indicated to come up?
Yes.
Yeah? And then I've got comrade with glasses at the back next, yeah.
This is really just a question. The small amount I've seen of what the organised trade union movement is doing in the US, it hasn't been very exciting to say the least. I know that very soon after his inauguration that Trump actually met with a whole roomful of trade union leaders who are jumping on the bandwagon of saving American jobs and the idea of protectionism and so on and so forth. And I mean, I know there's been movements over people working in fast food restaurants, the cleaners and so on and so forth, the organisation at that level. But other than that, I can't detect any sign that the trade union movement is really taking part in the resistance to Trump.
After this person, yeah.
I thought it's worth spelling out a little bit more about Hillary Clinton, because, you know, I've got to be honest with you, I can't stand the woman. And I think she no more represents women's interests than Theresa May does, quite frankly. And she, but of course, one of the claims was that if you supported women's rights, you really had to vote for Hillary Clinton, that this really was, you know, to get a woman president would be a great, you know, brilliant thing for women's liberation and so on. But I think, you know, I think it was Susan Sarandon who said, well, I'm not going to vote for, I don't vote with my uterus, actually. Thank you very much. I don't just work with one bit of my body, thanks so much, actually. And it's so interesting, really, to see, therefore, Bernie Sanders really getting far more support from young women than Hillary Clinton did, in a similar sort of way, you know, perhaps that Jeremy Corbyn does. You know, but I read a quite interesting biography of Hillary Clinton recently, which really goes through how opportunism her reactionary ideas about actually, women's rights, but also, black rights. Actually, she supported policies whilst her husband, Bill Clinton was in office, of policies that actually ended up with more black people in prison than there had been before. Contempt, actually, during her campaign for the Black Lives Matter movement, in fact. And again, this woman is absolutely pro-war. She is absolutely a hawk. She's really one of the people with serious responsibility for the disaster in Libya as well. So this woman's record, I respect women. Actually, I want to be judged on my record, and I think Hillary Clinton should accept the same. And I think we should be clear as well, therefore, that the Democratic Party is not the same as the Labour Party in any way. It has no working class roots at all. So even when, with some of the worst leaders of the Labour Party, that, I think we have to say there is not an equivalence there. And I'm quite interested to know, during the Sanders campaign for leadership, there were people writing and talking about the need perhaps for an alternative left party to the Democrats, and I was wondering really where that's gone, if anywhere, and if there's anything about that. So just finally, I think for me, I live in Manchester. An individual called a women's march on Facebook in Manchester, and we thought, oh, well, what's that going to be like? Well, it was big. We haven't seen such a big march for women for a very, very long time in Manchester, and I think, therefore, somebody asked me recently whether we thought it was a good thing somebody like Trump would be elected, and I said, well, no, actually I don't. It doesn't mean it's good for the movement, but actually we do know that Trump's opponents on the right fear the impact that he could have, and absolutely I think we need to make those fears come true, don't we? Here.
Just behind you.
Okay. Yeah, Piers Corbyn speaking on my own behalf, in case anyone writes things down. I agree very much with the last speaker. And I think that, well, I want to ask a question really. Isn't it really that our own vocabulary and the vocabulary of the mainstream media, who are manipulating vocabulary, is actually limiting our ability to really understand what is going on in America? First of all, you see, Hillary calls herself the left, and then people are imbued by this and think, oh, well, the Democrats are left. Well, hang on. The bombing of hundreds of thousands of people in Libya is in no way in our vocabulary in England left-wing. Okay? So why should we go along with that? And the anti-Trump movement now, if you look at it, is funded by George Soros. I mean, it doesn't mean there aren't people genuinely anti-Trump, but, there's huge expenditure to get people on the street, hiring buses and so on, against Trump. So what we have is a split in the capitalist class, if you like, on whether Trump or Hillary are best. Now, Sanders voters mostly voted for Trump in the end, because they couldn't stick with Hillary. And that, that's a fact, and we have to wrestle with that. And they voted for him because of what he said for American jobs and against wars. Now, I'm not saying he's delivering on those, but that's what he said. Whereas Hillary was perfectly clear. She's for continuing enslavement of the American working class, doesn't care a damn if jobs are exported as long as Wall Street gains, and she wants more wars because it helps the arms industry. We can't call that stuff left-wing. It doesn't mean the Democrats are left-wing or revolutionary or the harbingers of socialism either. We have to, not bemuse ourselves. And the Greens actually said that World War III was more likely under Clinton than under Trump. That's what they actually said, right? Okay, is that 1 or 2 minutes?
1 minute.
A minute left, okay. I think the idea, as mentioned by the last speaker, that the Republicans are somehow more like Tories and the Democrats are more like Labour is just silly. I mean, it's a different setup in America. I mean, I know in the American Civil War which side I would be on. I would have been on the Republican side. I would have been against the Democrats who were for carrying on slavery, right? I mean, that's the origin of these parties. Now, lots has happened since then, but I think the origin of these parties is important. And I agree very much with the speaker's sort of view, well, you know, to hell with all of them, really. And I think we should say more to hell with all of them. Okay, we can be against Trump, but you know, for many people that implies we're for Hillary. Well, no, we're not. I think we should have, not that we can decide anything for America, but we do want a proper independent march for health in America. And look, Obamacare was utter crap, it's theft by the insurance companies. What Trump is saying is probably nonsense too, but we have to have, you know, a proper march for a proper health service in America. And I would say, in terms of jobs and actual income, we go for rank and file action to demand higher wages and then demand Trump supports you. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, my name's Josh, I'm a member of the SWP in central London. A comrade asked earlier about what the unions are up to. And I think it's interesting really because, like Lewis was saying, with the Democratic Party, they're quite happy to kind of, the top echelons of the Democratic Party, they're quite happy for Trump to kind of dig his own grave or wait a few years. And I think that's kind of what's going on with the union leadership in a way. Like you were saying earlier, a group of them, the top heads of the unions did meet with Trump to start with, and were quite, you know, happy to kind of allow him to get on with it. One of the big things that Trump did in the run up to the elections was he went to this plant that made air conditioning units called Carrier, and he made the big deal out of this. Carrier was taking jobs, and they were going to go to Mexico, and they was going to take jobs away from Indiana and things. And he made a big thing of saying, when I become president, the head of Carrier is going to call me up, and we're going to keep jobs in the United States. And after the election, he really tried very hard to keep that going, to try and keep the jobs there, and he wasn't able to, and he spent a lot of time trying to play into the union, try to get the union around him, and now what we're finding is that those jobs are going to go away. But back to the point I was making about the union leadership, the fact that they think that we're just going to allow this to happen, that, you know, Trump, we don't really need the resistance. Really, you know, there shouldn't be any qualms about confidence here. The fact of the matter is that over the last couple of years we have seen rising strikes, rising trade union movement in the United States. I mean, during the election, Verizon workers, one of the biggest telecoms corporations in the world, workers at that on the East Coast went out on strike, and they won. They won lots of concessions, and they, you know, they really put the boot in. And actually, that union, the CWA, the Communications Workers Union, came out in support of Sanders, one of the only unions to do so on a national level. And I think, you know, there is a possibility for a fight back there. And we've seen that as well with some of the other union things that have gone on in opposition to some of Trump's policies. So the taxi drivers union, you know, perhaps not always the most radical set of workers, but actually a very diverse workforce. When the Muslim ban got announced, they refused, you know, the union, the taxi drivers unions refused to work, and they went and they joined the pickets at the airports. And you saw it with the nurses union coming in support of single-payer healthcare, I believe, in California. And what happened there was that got shut down. It got shut down, I think, last week or a couple of weeks ago by corporate Democrats. Democrats in California said, we want single-payer healthcare. If Obamacare is under attack, we want something better in our state. And they started to do that, and the bill was come forward and it got shut down by the corporate Democrats. So I think there's reasons to be hopeful and reasons to think that we can have a working class fight back in the United States. But I think, like Lewis was saying, if it comes via the Democrats and we allow the top echelons to get away with it, it's not going to happen. The Fight for 15 movement, that has to continue to be built on the ground. We need a mass movement on the streets to give confidence to the unions.
So I'm also a Canadian American. I have a lot of cousins down there, and I have a lot of cousins up here. Anyway, I wanted to talk about the health issue in the United States, because I think it really is explosive. The healthcare industry is, as I believe, the fastest growing industry in America. It is the biggest employer in many areas. In some cities and towns, it is the only major employer since the decline of the manufacturing industry. That and prisons. And it's not an accident that the National Nurses Union was the organizing force behind Bernie Sanders' recent conference, and also the National the National Union of Health Workers The health sector is the most rapidly organizing sector in terms of unionization. And it goes counter to to the decline of unionization in all the other sectors of America. And the concern about Trump here is it's going to devastate the economies of towns and cities and regions that rely on the healthcare industry for employment. And not to mention that the majority of people who work in the industry are women who require abortion rights to be able to continue to work. And at the same time, you have a massive crisis of pain in the United States. They call it an opioid epidemic. It is an epidemic of pain that is badly managed, that is being badly managed, and has been opportunistically seized by the pharmaceutical industry to sell drugs. But what it is pain, and it is biggest in the areas of highest unemployment, in the Rust Belt in particular. And now that so many people have been hooked on drugs because the industry does not want to pay for the alternatives to pain management, like physiotherapy, massage, exercise, whatever is required. So they put them on drugs, and now they're saying, we're going to cut you off drugs, and we're going to cut you off healthcare. So now you have massive epidemic of death. Death to the point that one counselor in the city said that we're going to stop sending the ambulances out if you've had more than 2 calls because we can't afford to be going out 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day to stop people from dying from heroin overdoses. This is a massive crisis, and I think it's an opening across a lot of the working class population for unity around these issues.
Thank you. So my first point is that the Democratic Party weren't always like this, it seems, and that the point at which it changed was mostly in the 80s, when it had to rely on corporate money to be able to, in their eyes, do better and progress. And the challenge that they have right now is, as you mentioned, they're kind of pulling out their hair, not recognizing why people wouldn't vote for them, given that they keep saying how moral and wrong Trump is. But the problem is that Trump is actually quite appealing to in part, to the working class, and he does talk about the issues. Bernie Sanders, interestingly, just like Trump, isn't as reliant on the lobbyists, although we all know that Trump, in some ways, sort of does as they want him to. My second is actually a question, and that is mostly, to what extent has Trump been effective at appealing to the working class? And to what extent is his plan to continue to build on that for the next elections? His first meeting after the inauguration was with the trade union movement, and he does repeatedly talk about jobs. Now, whether we think or not that is all a bunch of lies, he is talking about the points, and that is what people care about. Insofar as this recent elections, be it France, the US, prior to that, even Obama's win, these are mostly outsiders coming in. And at times where outsiders are being looked to and are sort of winning, it does help for those looking for change. So one of the interesting things, a few things that I think will help the left movement is that as a result of Trump's election, one will be just the rise of awareness. There's so much more greater political activism with the Justice Democrats and a range of other similar movements across the US and elsewhere as a result of having someone like Trump in power. Second is just like a real kick to the establishment across the board, the DNC and all the news and the stories that came out of how they all were sort of supporting Hillary behind the scenes in a very undemocratic way, and how people are tired of not just, hopefully soon, the Republicans, but also the Democrats and the way the DNC operates, and hopefully that will bring about some change. Third is a point how, in times like this, we will be very able and visibly see who really is principled and who isn't. Like you mentioned already, we can now tell which Democrats are going to go on to supporting Trump policies, whereas it wouldn't always be as easy to spot those if it were a Hillary win. One of the best is going to be with Trump putting out as many neoliberal policies as he can. Hopefully this will help demystify a lot of them as and when they are enacted and bear no fruits. Fifth is the drive for social cohesion. In times of oppression, we've already seen more grassroots movements, more support for the anti-ban of migrants and other sort of the Muslim ban and so on. It is somewhat a test of the democratic protection put together in the Constitution, to some extent, how as far right-wing and as a fascist you may be, there are still protection measures that can stop things getting worse. This, in all likelihood, has already started, but it's weakening the American sort of colonial power base. And just finally, on balance, there's nothing that quite fires up the left as a sort of fascist, a xenophobe, racist as Trump. So on balance, I think it's going to turn out to be quite a good thing.
I have a question because I watched a lot of young people get involved in politics, some for the first time around the question of Trump, and a lot of people had a lot of anger around what was happening in America, and a lot of that anger was directed at Trump, and they got involved in the anti-Trump movement. And I had a lot of arguments with people about them not directing that anger in terms of developing support for Hillary Clinton as an opposition to Trump. And my question is about what can we do to capture young people's anger who are getting involved in politics for the first time around this question, and get them involved not just in the anti-Trump movement, but beyond that in strengthening the left in America.
So I was working in Seattle at a youth hostel, and I was expressing my views when the presidential debates were going on, and I was bringing up ideas of equal rights, gay marriage, and everyone was agreeing with me, and then you'd say the word socialist and everyone would go, shh. And they wouldn't vote because they didn't have a candidate where these kind of young ideas were being displayed, but like candidates like Jill Stein or Stein, however you pronounce that, were unheard of. You were saying them, and they're like, who's that? And they just saw the two-party solution that they have in the United States. So there's a huge gap on the left that needs filling, and that can be filling through trade unions, people uprising, a huge movement. And we've seen this in Black Lives Matter, the International Women's March, and so on. That the Republicans tearing themselves apart is complete rubbish. It really hasn't happened ever in history. So if we look internationally, like Trump could be here within the next week, he could be here tomorrow, we don't really know. If you look what's happening in Hamburg, there's been huge resistance, and I feel like the same is going to happen in this country. So maybe we don't have to look at a party or a union to lead the left, or maybe it can just be an uprising of people getting together.
Yourself next after this speaker.
On the back of what a comrade said before about the strike of the taxi drivers, I think that it was very powerful. Inspired by that strike, over 1,000 so-called bodegas, the ones that we call corner shops, owned by Yemeni, shut down in protest for the Muslim ban. Now, if you've ever been to the States, you know that this place is never, ever, ever, ever closed. Like literally, I was shocked, like with the snow like so high, and they were like open, like wow, this place is like really, like they are always open, always open. So it was really, really, for me, quite powerful. Now, I don't rely on business owners to start a revolution. However, I think that it really shows the contradiction of Trump politics, the fact that the Muslim ban is such a stupid blanket ban that even business owners, not to talk about big corporations as well, are like completely against. So, yeah.
Next speaker, I didn't see any more hands. Have we got time for one more? If anybody wants to let me know. Okay.
Thanks. Chris Sow, UCU, SWP. One of the things that's always struck me about being, as a British person, is this interesting view that we have about Americans and how superficial they might be in their outlook. It comes from American movies and so on. And how we feel ourselves to be more sophisticated. And I certainly know that this is something I probably felt in my early teens, certainly. Certainly know it's not true now. But one of the things that I think is quite important is the superficiality of the election process in America. I read a book back in probably about 1980s, before I was particularly well politically sussed, I guess, which was advocating how the US Constitution and the US electoral system was the most advanced democracy in the world. And this was written from a left-wing writer. It might have been E.P. Thompson, I can't remember if it is, if it's not, I apologise. But arguing that this was the best way of organising democracy in the world at the time. And I guess this is against the backdrop of the House of Lords in the UK and what was going on in Eastern Europe and all this kind of thing, and lots of emerging countries with problems. The big issue, I think, though, that it arises out of this, if it is a wonderful system, which is problematical, is that it's a beauty pageant. At the end of the day, that's really what it boils down to. It's very little more than that. It's a series of elite people engaging in a political process where they're pandering to another group of elite. And this is where Trump has actually, I think, has been quite successful in a way, because he's good at beauty pageants, let's be honest, he's got a lot of experience of that kind of thing. And what he's done is he's set an interesting sort of agenda. He's set an agenda which is anti-establishment, okay, we're all anti-establishment, but that's going to captivate all those people who don't normally participate in that beauty pageant and find it alienating. And that's quite a good agenda. What he's done is he's set that right from the beginning to say, actually, I'm anti-establishment. Yeah, I'll go through the process of being elected, but I'm going to dismantle it and wreck it. And what I'm going to do in the process is I'm going to try and make things better for the people who are alienated. At the end of the day, of course, he won't do that, but his promises like building walls with Mexico, getting rid of Obamacare, well, most people don't know what Obamacare actually is. They don't realise that they're actually dependent on Obamacare, a lot of people in the US. The issue about Islamophobia, and issues of all these kind of things that he's managed to evoke, or picking on fears within certain aspects of American society where competition or the system has let them down in such a dramatic way. And I think what the tragedy is that there's never been a solution from Hillary Clinton, an alternative to that. She's part of the establishment and people are alienated from that. The sad thing about what we're saying about Bernie Sanders is, yes, there was a glimmer of hope within that framework, within the Democratic Party, that something might emerge. It was never going to emerge really within the framework of the Democratic Party. At the end of the day, he was going back into the beauty pageant game. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Cheers. Actually, I'll just stuck my hand up just in response to what the comrade who said that we should take heart about the stuff that's going on in Germany at the moment, the protests against Trump, and actually, do we need to, that really we should be looking at the movement, and do we need to worry? Because actually, I think the phrase that the comrade used here, which said that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of movements, is really, really pertinent. I think when you look at the history of America, it's strange we're now looking how sort of conservative, and we're looking at Trump, and actually, when you read, there's a fantastic book, people should read it, Howard Zinn, People's History of America, because when you read about the militancy and the fightbacks that have happened in America, actually, to be honest, some of it made Britain look quite small scale. When you look at the sit-down movement in the 1930s, when you look at some of these obviously the civil rights movement and the big fightbacks, it's amazing. And actually, you're right. When you look at what happened in the civil rights movement, how actually those radical people could just be sucked into that milieu of of electoral politics. It's a real dangerous for us, I think. And I think it's really important that we, when we look at what's going on in Hamburg at the moment, and we see the anti-capitalist protesters, we should be cheering and we should be shouting. But actually, some of us in the movement can remember, going to Genoa and going to other places and seeing how these big movements. I was in a movement in Genoa, 300,000 people. Fantastic, massive thing, but these things can really, really explode, and they can really, really come down quickly. And I think, it's really, really important that we understand that there are no shortcuts to these things. That we want to celebrate the resistance, but unless we can pull them together, and then we can do stuff. And the comrade who said about what we can be doing in Britain to get younger people involved, I think we need to say to young people, we've got Corbyn here, and it looks great. We're thinking, it's great. The political mood in Britain has changed, but actually, Corbyn will face a whole set of challenges, around the economy, around the bloody British ruling class trying to put it back. And I think here, more so than in America, we have got the chance to put a nucleus of people to the left that can act as a pole of opposition. And I think, sometimes I think you can go to Marxism and it can be a bit like everyone saying, join a revolutionary party, that's the answer. We're not saying that. There's no simple rules, but there's no simple, magic wand solutions. But we need to learn the message of America. The message of America are that actually you can have big, massive struggles, but unless you've got a group that can put it together and actually argue for a framework, even if that's only a small group, we need to make sure that actually we don't get caught in that trap, and we make sure that we have to argue for a consistent group of people who can actually pull all the workers' struggles together, and there's no shortcut, I'm afraid.
So I'm going to bring Lewis back in to sum up.
Well, look, thanks for that, everyone. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. I just wanted to come back on the point a lot of people raised about unions and what you raised about, Trump appealing to the working class, because I agree with what people said. The fact that the unions met Trump, in the first sort of week, I think shows. Well, it just shows the level of the politics of some of the union leaders. The narrowness of their politics to say that Trump is promising jobs, so therefore that means my members are going to benefit, so I'm going to support him. Never mind what he says about abortion or deporting some of my members or, restricting their rights and so on. It shows the narrowness, the narrow vision that some union leaders can have. I guess the question for us, though, is what will happen when Trump doesn't deliver on these promises. Like I said, the economy is going to hamstring a lot of his policy, his promises. What will happen when he doesn't deliver? One way it could go is that the far right could try and exploit out of it. I mean, we haven't talked about it much in this meeting, but we should be under no illusions that the alt-right in America feel really emboldened. Nazis and racists have seen a bigot and a racist in the White House, and they think they can now fly the flag. So you have, even student groups of Nazis on campuses giving out literature for white students to come together and reclaim their country, and so on. We've got to argue that the left has to put forward a fight to win over trade unionists and working class people, and so that when Trump doesn't deliver, we try and funnel that anger leftwards. And for that to happen, we'll need two things. Josh raised it. We'll need to see the continuation of struggle and a development and a rise in the level of struggle. And that's why, the small but significant strikes of the Chicago teachers, of the Verizon workers, of the Fight for 15 and so on, that's why the priority, if you're a socialist in America, has to be to support those movements and build solidarity with them. But also, if we're to funnel any anger at Trump leftwards, it cannot be through the Democrats, because what the election showed is that working class people do not want to vote for the Democrats and do not want to vote for the Democrat elite. So to go back to these people and say that the way out of Trump is to retreat back into the Democrats will not get you a hearing. And that's why arguing for a new, a movement that doesn't rely on Democrat money and the Democrat elite is important. On the question that people raised about the Labour Party and the Democrats, I think it's a good one, isn't it? Because obviously, what you think is that, like people said, the Republicans are the Tories and the Democrats are Labour. But you see, there's a big difference between the Democrats and the Labour Party here, which is that no matter how right-wing the Labour Party can become, the Labour Party was formed out of the working class movement. The Labour Party was started by socialists and trade unionists and a TUC wanting to set up a party in Parliament that represented working class interests. And it might sound obvious to say that now with Corbyn as leader of it, but even with Tony Blair and New Labour, Labour did have links to the working class. It had ties to the working class, and the unions have a big vote about who gets elected into the Labour Party. They give it lots of money, and so on. And you see, the Democrats aren't like that. The comrade at the back said, the Democrats haven't always been like this. You're right. I mean, in the Civil War, the Democrats were the party of slavery. Recently, the Democrats have been... in 2008, 2012, the Democrats were supposed to be the party of change. Obama's whole election of yes, we can, of trying to change the world in America. Of course, it's not true that the Democrats have always occupied the centre ground. But what is true is what people have said, that the Democrats have always acted on a block towards radical change. I mean, even in the 60s, when you had left-wing people running to be the Democrat candidate, the hierarchy at the top of the party would block them, because the Democrat doesn't have any links to unions, to the working class, it doesn't have any democratic elections, and so on. And I think when Dean talks about how the Democrats can be a sponge and a buffer, it's completely true, and you see that with the civil rights movement. What the Democrats did in response to the civil rights movement is they got a load of leaders of the civil rights movement, people like Jesse Jackson and plenty of black activists, and they made them mayors, they made them district mayors, they made them senators and congressmen and so on. And these people have acted like a buffer for any movement that has tried to challenge racism in America. So you see that when Black Lives Matter happens, they send out a black sheriff or they send out a black mayor to go and calm down the protests and say, come on, let's have a discussion about this, come and meet me at the town hall, make sure that you get active and we vote for better legislation and for better candidates. And we have to say that if this was to happen with the Trump movement, it would be a recipe for disaster. if the Women's March simply says that the key to beating Trump is to elect Elizabeth Warren, a left-wing woman Democrat, in 2020, this is going to be, one, it's going to be too late, but two, will the Democrats have Elizabeth Warren? And even if they do, is she going to be able to take on the evangelical right and the people who want to restrict abortion access and so on? And this, you know, just to finish really, brings me to the point that the comrades from Canada raised, because I think it's really interesting to hear that about how even, you know, at every level really, the explosion around Sanders has meant that an interest in socialist and left-wing ideas has gone up on the rise, and you see that when society polarises, like it is across the world, the centre ground cannot hold. People who are worried about living standards, about wages, about healthcare, about services, saying that we're going to have more of the same doesn't fit. And this is why we've seen Corbyn, we've seen Sanders, and so on. And obviously a big part of that is what Jack raised about young people. A poll was done about, I think after the election, which said that for 18 to 29-year-olds, 52% of them who responded were against capitalism, and 33% of them supported socialism. Now, that's quite a remarkable figure, I think, for America. And I think that shows that these are people who wanted a political revolution that Sanders promised, not the revolution in the Democrat Party. If Sanders' promises of political revolution are simply limited to getting a few more left-wing candidates in the Democrats, I don't think those young people will be satisfied. This isn't the kind of revolution that they argued for. And I think the question for us is, both in America and here with Corbyn, is how do we relate to that? As the revolutionary left, how do we relate to the shift in mood? You know, there's a massive tidal wave of shifting towards left-wing politics and an interest in socialism. The absolute worst thing to do would be to say that it's all doomed for failure. If you're a socialist or a revolutionary in the US, to say that Sanders is somehow going to capitulate and that we should just wait for that would be the absolute worst thing to do. We have to throw ourselves into activity with these people. If you're a socialist in America right now, or if you're a socialist in England, you have to say that both Sanders and Corbyn show that people want change, now let's act on it. On the Muslim ban, on the Islamophobia here, on the cuts to taxes to the rich in America, on the pay cap here, we have to say that we need joint action between revolutionaries and those in both the Democrats and Labour to take on those questions. But see, we also have to have the discussions about where we're going. Francois Hollande was a Bernie Sanders. He was a Jeremy Corbyn. Francois Hollande said we're going to squeeze the rich, we're going to tax the rich. He ends up implementing austerity, whipping up Islamophobia, and so on. Syriza said this is the end of austerity in Greece. This is the end of the deportation of refugees. They've brought in a worse austerity package and they've deported refugees back to Turkey. And the point here isn't to say that this is inevitable. The point here is to say that we can prevent this, that action can prevent this. And that therefore the role of revolutionaries, whether you're in the US or in the UK, is to build on the political mood, is to argue, is to work with people in building movements that build on the scale of resistance we've seen over the last 2 years, but to also make the point that unless we challenge the system, unless we break free of the parties that just want to sort of go around the edges, unless we do that, we'll never be able to get rid of a world that creates people like Donald Trump, that creates people like Theresa May, and so on. So I'll leave it there.